This lecture is being brought to you in part by the generous gifts of these sponsors.
Thank you, Ken and Nancy and the IHMC family for having me here tonight. I'm going to share with you some dirty, dark secrets of the wine business. Are there any wine drinkers in the room? There's a lot you don't know about wine. I'm not here to sell you wine. I'm here to educate you about how to drink healthier wines. Now there we go. I'm going to share some secrets with you about the wine industry. Here's the first thing that's going on. Like what's happened in our food supply, the same thing has happened in the wine supply. So there's been massive corporate consolidation around greed and money. So 52% of all the wines manufactured, now the wine industry wants to use wine making as a term, but actually wines in the United States are manufactured. 52% of the wines manufactured in the United States are made by just 3 giant conglomerates, and the top 30 companies make over 70% of U.S. wines. Now, they want to have you believe that you're drinking from a chateau or a farmhouse, when in fact, you're drinking from massive wine factories that are located in Central California. So all these wines you see in the grocery store and in bottle shops are primarily made by a handful of companies. Now, these guys are pretty smart. They run these multi-billion-dollar marketing organizations, right? So they hide behind thousands of brands and labels to confuse you. And I'm going to tell you what they're really doing to wine. This is what a real wine cellar looks like. This is actually a cellar in the Umbria region in Italy. This is, as you can see, I'm standing in it. And this cellar's been making wine since the 1700s. What's happening in the vineyard is even more troubling, or as troubling, as what's happening in the cellar. So we're killing the soils around the world through industrial farming, industrial agriculture, and that is, grape farming is no different than the rest of agriculture. So, in fact, glyphosate is the #1 applied herbicide in U.S. vineyards. And glyphosate and traces of glyphosate have been found in 100% of California wines that have been tested both on organic vineyards as well as inorganic. And the reason that that's believed to be true is it's thought that the glyphosate is getting in the fruit and in the wine through irrigation. So more than 99.9%, we're going to talk more about this in a moment, more than 99.9% of U.S. vineyards are irrigated. Now, the name of my company is Dry Farm Wines, and dry farming means that you don't use any irrigation. In fact, in most of Europe, it's against the law to irrigate. It's a crime. Europeans who've been making wine over 3,000 years know what I know. When you irrigate a grapevine, you fundamentally change the physiology of how the grape ripens, primarily. And I'm going to talk more about irrigation in a moment, but we're killing the soil. There's this other little thing that's going on. This is how you get business done in Washington. There's a big, deep, dark collusion between the wine industry and politicians. And the wine industry has spent tens of millions of dollars to keep you uninformed, and here's how they do it. There's no contents label on a bottle of wine. It's the only major food product without a contents label. The simple reason why there's no contents label on it, because if it had a contents label on it, it would look just like this label here, right? And what they want you to believe is that it's just fermented grape juice. That, in fact, is not true. In fact, and all of what I'm telling you, including the wine manufacturers, the statistics, everything I'm going to share with you tonight is easily available on Google, including the 76 wine additives approved by the FDA for the use in winemaking. Now, the wine industry keeps labeling off so you don't really know what's in it. The wine I drink, the wine you drank, most of the wine you drank tonight, we ran out actually just at the end there, but most of the wine you drank tonight is pure and nothing but fermented grape juice. This is a partial list of the 76 additives approved by the FDA for the use in winemaking in the United States, including the last one. And I also want to mention that if you go into a store, like Whole Foods as an example, and you see organic wines, that does not mean that the wine is pure. That does not mean that it does not contain additives. That simply means it was organically farmed. So there are 155,000 wineries in the world. Less than 0.1% are additive-free and natural, and I'm going to describe to you what the term natural wine means. Natural wine is a category of wines. There are less than 1,500 growers in the world who grow these wines. This is exclusively what I sell. There are no U.S. wine growers, there are no domestic wines in the United States that meet our standards of health and purity. So all of our wines come from small family farms in Europe, and I have 4 growers in South Africa, 2 in Chile. The rest are spread all across Europe. This very last dimethyl bicarbonate is a particularly nasty poison that I wanted to tell you about for just a moment. It's known in the industry as Valcarin. Valcarin, as you can see over here from the Wikipedia page, its main hazard is that it's toxic. Now, the FDA allows up to 200 parts per million of this chemical to remain in U.S. wines. Well, let me tell you about this nasty toxic chemical. First of all, Scott Laboratories makes it. As you can see, they require annual safety training, and they warn here that it is a chemical and must be handled with respect. Well, let me tell you what they mean by that. Valcarin is applied, the engineers applying it are in hazmat suits. No one else can be in the winery for 24 hours of application. No one can be in the winery when it is applied, and if you were to drink the wine within 24 hours of application, you would die. Now, this chemical is used to treat the single most common bacterial fault in wines, known as Brettanomyces. It's a very common bacterial fault that grows in cellars. There are tens of millions of gallons of wine that are treated in California with this chemical every year. So these are the kind of things that you need to know about when you're thinking, if you drink wine on a regular basis. So the 2 most common questions that I get is, how did you get in this business, which I'll tell you now. And the second one is, how are your wines sugar-free? Because we only sell sugar-free wines. I'm going to answer that for you too. I got into this business because I was a health enthusiast and a biohacker, and people commonly ask, what is a biohacker? Does anybody here have that question? Sure. Biohacking is the art and science of how we alter our behavior to influence our biological and neurological outcome. Well, what's all that mean? The art and science is the reason we say an art and a science, because most biohacking has no legitimate scientific proof, because there's not control group studies to really prove that many of these hacks, which is a term from Silicon Valley, that these shortcuts to better health and longevity actually work. But for those of us who practice them, anecdotally, we believe that they work. And I judge the choices. The most common biohack would be a diet, right? So if you have a specific diet, that's a biohack. You're altering your biological and neurological outcome from what you eat. Others are cold thermogenesis or training regimens and any type of behavior that has this impact or an influence on biology or neurology. So I make these choices around biohacking using the proverb, to feel is to understand. So if I'm practicing a diet, I feel better, then I think it works for me. And since we're all different, different things work for different people. But so that's how I got in this business, was that I needed to find a way to drink healthier and better. I drink about a bottle of wine a day, and well, sometimes two, but it's my grandmother, if she were alive, would probably be very proud that I was able to find a way to pay to drink to get paid. But let's talk about alcohol for a moment. Most people are very surprised to hear the wine guy say alcohol is a very dangerous neurotoxin, and which is the reason that at Dry Farm Wines, we only drink and sell low alcohol wines. What is a low alcohol wine? I sell wines as low as 6% and nothing over 12.5%. In the United States, the average alcohol content of a bottle of wine is nearly 15% today, and that's been rising steadily over the last 30 years. So 30 years ago, all wines in the United States were also 12 or 12.5% alcohol. And the reason that alcohol levels have been rising is that wine companies like alcohol. Turns out alcohol is addictive. Alcohol is also what I call a domino drug. And by that, what I mean is that the more you drink, the more you're likely to drink, right? And the more wine they sell. And so given the dangerous aspects of alcohol, we recommend only drinking low alcohol and in moderation. And so alcohol is an extremely destructive and dangerous drug. And so being in the wine business, people are always surprised to hear me say that, but it's another reason that I got in this business. I wanted to drink lower alcohol wines, right? I love wine. I don't love alcohol as a drug. Here's another thing that is very different between natural wines and conventional wines. Natural wines are always fermented, and we're going to talk about fermentation in a moment because that's how we get to the sugar explanation. Natural wines, I know that's a confusing term because people think, well, aren't all wines natural? But in fact, they're not, for reasons that I'm explaining to you. All natural wines are always fermented with wild native yeast that are indigenous to the vineyard. So every grape fruit in the world has this, at harvest, has this kind of white, waxy look on the outside of the fruit. That is yeast that's been collected through the air. It's a wild native yeast. So if you just pick a ripe cluster of berries and you were to throw it in a bucket and the skins break open, it will start fermenting because the yeast will come in contact with the sugar. And you don't have to do anything at all. You'll start making, it won't be very good, but you'll start making wine in that bucket, right? But see, the conventional commercial winemakers, people we've been talking about with all these secrets, the first thing they do is they dump sulfur dioxide into the juice to kill the native yeast so that they can inoculate it with this genetically modified lab-grown yeast like you see on the right. Now, there's several reasons why they do that. These wild native yeast, they're temperamental. They're difficult to work with, and you can't make wine in very high volumes with them, right? The other reason is that native yeast, these wild native yeast, will not withstand a high alcohol environment. And because of the sugar levels, and we'll talk about this in a moment when we talk about fermentation, because of the sugar levels at the time of picking, primarily driven by irrigation, I'm going to explain this to you in a moment, because of the sugar levels, wines become very high alcohol in the U.S., and then they have to remove the alcohol. Well, this high alcohol environment will kill a native yeast. The third reason that they use these genetically modified yeast is, let's just say that you grow a rather mundane fruit, grape in Central California, but you want to make a wine that tastes like it's from Italy. They got a yeast for that. So this is what, this is just what's happening and the thing is the wine industry's been able to keep all this secret out, although I've told a few million people about it now and helped a lot of people drink a healthy product that they feel better from and don't suffer from nasty hangovers. And diabetics are able to drink our wines because they're sugar-free and they have no impact on ketone production or no impact on blood glucose. Here's what's happening at the end of the winemaking process in commercial wines. Another massive dose of sulfur dioxide at the time of bottling. And what this does is kill everything that's living in the wine, right? It McDonaldizes, it mummifies the wine. So it gives it this consistent shelf taste bottle to bottle. It also kills all of the healthy bacteria that is in wine. So there are many bacteria in natural wines that are actually beneficial to your microbiome and to the gut flora. Those have all been killed in commercial wines. It also kills the life of the wine. So the wine has less spirit to it. It has just less life. And so that's when you drink a natural wine, you can taste the actual life and the terroir and the place that the wine was grown. How to drink healthy wines. This is some of my staff. We like to have a lot of parties. And what is a natural wine? So I want to go into more specific detail about exactly what we call it, a philosophy of pure artisan wines handcrafted with honesty. Integrity, meaning that it's not irrigated. Irrigation is the first intervention into Mother Nature's logic. We don't think that we really have to intervene on Mother Nature. And so, as you'll see, also for many of you have probably been to California. Many of you have probably seen California vineyards or U.S. vineyards. They don't look like this. Actually, they look like the moonscape, right? You guys know what I'm talking about? They're dark. They're hard. That's because everything in and around the vine has been killed, right, to make it easier to farm. This is what a natural vineyard looks like, and I'm going to show you several examples here. It is lush and teeming with life. And the other thing we'll get into in just a moment is that natural farmers generally don't plow. We're going to talk about that in a second. So dry farming, no irrigation, organic biodynamic farming, native yeast and fermentation, additive-free, nothing in, nothing out. That's a natural wine. Now, natural wines for you, unfortunately, like in Pensacola, will be very difficult to get. We're the largest buyer and seller of natural wines in the world, so we take up most of the U.S. inventory. And they're only available in specific large markets. Like you could find some in New York or Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, but in Florida, would be very difficult to find them. But there's an app called Raisin, so you can go to your smartphone and try to locate them that way. Or you can do a Google search for natural wines. And if there's a retailer anywhere near you, they'll likely come up on a search. At Dry Farm Wines, our health and purity standards go way beyond natural. So as Ken mentioned, we're the only health quantified wine merchant in the world. And I'm not here to sell you wine. I really just want to educate you so you know how to think about, if you're going to be drinking wine on a regular basis, so you know how to think about purchasing wine. We do independent lab testing, so all of our wines must be less than 12.5% in alcohol. Now, why would we test for alcohol? Because there's another collusion between the wine industry and the government. The alcohol stated on a bottle of wine, by law, is not required to be accurate. Now, the reason for that is, like most alcohol laws, they were post-prohibition. So these laws were written in the 40s. And in the 1940s, you couldn't get an accurate alcohol sampling from lab to lab. So it would be inconsistent. You could test over here at this lab, and it would be a little different than this lab. Well, today, you might imagine that's no longer a problem. It's a very exact science. And so, but the alcohol industry, the wine industry, has left this loophole in the labeling law so that they can actually round down, right? Now, they round down for two reasons. One, they want you to think you're drinking less alcohol, but more importantly, they pay tax to the federal government based on the alcohol amount. So the higher the alcohol, the higher their taxes. See, there's a lot going on out there nobody's really talking about. So we also test for mycotoxins, so our wines are mold-free. This is another thing with the U.S. government. So if you're a European winery, the EU requires that all wines are tested for mycotoxins, and the primary one is ochratoxin A, which is very toxic, and these molds can be common in grape farming. U.S. government doesn't require wines to be tested for mycotoxins. The only time a U.S. wine is tested for mycotoxin is when it's exported to Europe, where it's required. We also test for sulfites, and so we will not accept a wine that has more than 75 parts per million. So when you see on a bottle of wine, this contains sulfites, that really doesn't mean a whole lot because many foods contain sulfites, and sulfite is a naturally occurring result of fermentation. So all fermented foods contain sulfites. The question is whether or not sulfur dioxide has been added to the wine, primarily at the time of bottling, or added at the time to kill the native yeast, as we talked about earlier. Dry farm wines is endorsed by over 1,000 health and medical leaders. How is our wine sugar-free? So I want to talk about fermentation and how a wine is or is not sugar-free, and most conventional wines contain sugar. As a health advocate and evangelist, I don't eat sugar, don't recommend that you do either. But so this was another thing that we test for. We test every wine for sugar content. We're going to talk about a couple of things about fermentation and difference in red and white wines in the fermented process, and why red wines are generally regarded as healthier. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But first of all, how wine becomes sugar-free. When you ferment wine, you crush the wine, you press the juice from the wine. In this case, you'll see the skins here have been added back to the juice. But in white wine, you press the juice from the skins, and then it goes into a tank without any skin contact, right? So if you squeeze the juice from a red wine grape and the juice from a white wine grape, they're both clear. Red wine gets its color from contact with the skin and seeds. That's also where it gets its tannin structure. It's also where it gets its additional health benefits in the way of polyphenols, antioxidants, and flavonoids and non-flavonoids. And so there are about 200-ish polyphenols in white wine. There are just over 800 in red wines. And the additional antioxidants and polyphenols come from contact with the skin and seeds, which is also where red wine gets its tannin structure. But when a wine is fermented, if it's allowed to fully ferment, and what that means is that the yeast eats all the available sugar. So that's fermentation. So you put the yeast, in this case natural yeast, yeast comes in contact with the grape juice, which is full of sugar, and the yeast eats the sugar, and the result of that is carbon dioxide and ethyl alcohol. If the wine is allowed to fully ferment, meaning the yeast is permitted to eat all of the available sugar, then the wine will be fully fermented and sugar-free. What's happening in commercial wines, because Americans love sugar, and sugar also adds density and boldness to wine, like those long finishes you get, that's glycerol. It's a sugar byproduct. You won't taste those in our wines, right? And so what commercial winemakers are doing is, again, introducing sulfur dioxide in the fermentation process to kill the yeast prior to it fully fermenting, leaving what's known as residual sugar, or RS, behind in the wine. So sugar is not added to wine. When sugar gets in wine, it's because the winemaker has intentionally broken the fermentation before it completes. And so in conventional wines you see in your grocery store, typically they'll range from 5 to 25 grams of sugar per liter. Coca-Cola has about 30 grams per liter, 32 grams per liter, to give you a kind of a reference point. Wines categorically can range from 0 grams to as high as 300 grams per liter. Now, the 300 grams per liter is like ice wines and sauternes and dessert wines, which are super, super sweet for those of you who have experienced them, maybe some ports. But in just conventional wines, you won't see that kind of sugar content. It'll generally be between 5 and 25 or 30 grams per liter, which is more than I want to drink. I'm interested in drinking sugar-free wine. A little bit more on irrigation. So Ken just sent me a 15-page science report written by a former guest speaker here, Dr. Colin Champ, who spoke here last year, just released a 15-page report with about 200 scientific studies cited. And among those were showing that, and I already knew this, but among those were showing that irrigation actually decreases the health value of wines, right? That might not come as a surprise because as you dilute the juice with water, you get a diluted health effect from the polyphenols. In addition to that, irrigation creates, and this is a reason it's illegal in Europe, it fundamentally impacts the character of the fruit. None of this is rocket science. If you fill a fruit berry full of water, you're going to impact the character of the fruit. Not only that, but an irrigated grapevine has a root ball that's about this wide and about that deep, right? It's about 3 feet by 3 feet because it gets all of its nutrient in the way of liquid nitrogen and all of its water from a little tube that's just above the trunk in a little drip irrigation system. And more than 99.9% of U.S. vineyards are irrigated. Now, why do you irrigate a grapevine? It might not surprise you, it's around money, right? And so you get higher yields, bigger clusters, and it may also not surprise you when you fill it with water, it weighs more, and guess what? Fruit's sold by the ton, right? That's why you irrigate. Grapevines have been living over 10,000 years in some of the harshest climates on the planet, some of the hottest places in the world, and have never been irrigated. In fact, irrigation didn't come to California and grape farming until 1973. Prior to that, everything in California was dry farmed as well. But the problem with the irrigation and the character of the fruit, you've got this very small root ball. In an unirrigated grapevine, you can have root structures that can go as deep as 50 feet, right? As these tiny little capillaries, as the vine struggles to find moisture and nutrient. That struggle and the struggle against its neighbor creates this character of fruit, right? And so just like with humans, or just like with all living organisms, resistance, right, creates power and character. Just like weightlifting or any other kind of resistance that we face, how we gain character in life from the resistance of failure and challenge and obstacles. Well, the grapevine's the same thing. You know, the grapevine's not trying to create wine. The grapevine has one goal, and that's to make its fruit the very best fruit so that the bird will choose its fruit to propagate its seed, right? So the grapevine is really struggling to make this great fruit. Then we come along and intervene in all that, beginning with irrigation, to create a fruit of lesser character. I want to talk about natural farming. I'm going to show you a video in a moment of a natural farmer in Italy. But as I talked about, this is what a natural vineyard looks like, right? It's a forestation of everything that is alive. And you'll see also here this farmer on the left in Austria, which grows these herbs below his vines to attract butterflies, right? So natural farmers are focused. You'll see also here this little bird nest that's actually on a trellis. So natural farmers, you know, we ended up with sort of this we used to have biodiversity was the way that farming was done until the 1930s or 40s when monocultural farming emerged because it was easier and more profitable, right? So natural farmers really focus on, they have orchards and animals and bees and herbs and just a lot of diversity on the farm. The thing that the natural farmer is most obsessed with is living soils. And this is I'm going to show you a video of this farmer here and his family and their obsession with living soils. So when you go to Napa Valley, where I live, and you come and see a vineyard, you never go out in the vineyard. You go into this tasting room, and they tell you about the famous winemaker, and you just taste wine, right? Has anybody had that experience? When you go to a natural farm, there is no tasting room. The only thing they really want to do is take you to the vineyard and talk about their soil, right? That's just their whole focus is on living soils. And I'm going to show you them speaking about it in a moment. I might warn you that this is the vineyard that photograph was taken in. And this is another vineyard on another farm in Italy. And this is the same vineyard. As you can see, it's very wild and alive. On the video, these guys don't speak very good English, so you'll have to bear with them. I think it's particularly interesting. I asked the question about plowing the vineyard in this video. And you'll notice that they talk about insects, but they call them small animals because they don't have the word for insects. So when you hear them referencing small animals, they're really talking about insects. And when the reason the natural farmer, and we'll talk about this, we'll show you this in this video. It's about a 4-minute video on this farm that we produced. The reason they don't plow is because when you turn over soil, you expose all the living organisms below that soil to the sun, and they die, right? And so this farmer, like many natural farmers, believe that the insects do the plowing for them, if you will, aerate the soil. So enjoy this brief video on this crazy Italian family who are friends of ours and make wine for us.
We have founded synergistic agriculture because it is impossible make very natural wine without a contact with our ground. And so when you marry philosophy in ground and philosophy in cellar, we make organic wine that is not just a certificated organic wine. No, we have synergic wine.
Wow.
Capito?
It's very
Tutta la
rich.
fertilità vera,
Pure minerals.
Very fertile.
pieno di
Yeah.
esseri viventi, pieno
Full
di
of-
esseri viventi.
Full of like animals, micro animals. Right now, here there is kind of everything. Okay.
Ok?
Biodiversity.
Perché questo?
Yeah.
Nel momento in cui c'è madre natura funziona come nel mare. Nel mare sai che c'è la balena, il pesce, il plankton.
So you know the sea that has the cycle that is the big fish is eating the little fish and etc.
Circle of life.
Yeah, exactly. Is the same on the land.
Yeah.
So he's preserving this kind of circle.
Allora, è come cioè chi si è ostinato negli ultimi 40 anni, 50 anni a fare l'agricoltura convenzionale, che vuol vedere un solo essere vivente sul terreno, è come se nel mare io volessi avere solo la balena, sai, uccidere tutto il resto e avere solo la balena. Può vivere solo la balena?
So a land with only one type of tree, one type of monoculture, monofarming, like, cannot live because we need the circle life. So in a land like this, there is the circle life. In a land like with only one typology of farming, you don't have it.
So this hasn't been plowed or touched in 7 years. Will you plow it again at some point, or just let it go forever?
Perché il terreno, ha visto che è tutto forato, tutto bucato, che è meglio che se tu ari, perché se tu ari crei le suole e diventa, invece quello è tutto bucato, è arato, non da me, dagli esseri viventi.
Okay. So the land is not polluted, as you said, by him, but it's polluted by the little animals. So he will not.
So he will never plow.
Il buco, si vede il buco?
Small animals.
Small animals.
This type of agriculture makes humus, okay? Because organic substance became humus, and so you can make life. When you move the ground, you stop this action of small animals, and so you for a long time take out humus by ground. In fact, today in the world, the most important part of ground is sterile. This is an important concept because often we think about big things, dreams, but this is the first important thing. We thanks to Dry Farm Wines for your visit. It's very important for us show you synergic vineyard and synergic wine. Thank you.
Grazie.
The other terrific thing that I get to do that is a very important part of my work is I have the pleasure of promoting and supporting small family farms. This family, also in the Puglia region of Italy, there's a couple of us in the photograph here, but a few of us. The rest of them are all from this one family. The grandfather, who's the founder of this farm, is in the center. He doesn't speak any English. Most of them don't speak English. And but they all work in the farm, and everything that they eat is produced on their farm. Everything they eat and drink. They have olives and orchards and gardens, and they produce cheese, and they have cows, and they're, but these people, like the former video, these people are just very committed to a way of life. And we want to support that way of life, which is the reason that we are able to offer very fair trade pricing to these farmers. And we only sell direct to consumers, so you can't go into a store or a restaurant and buy our wines. And the reason for that is that we've kind of removed everybody in the equation between us, between the farmer and the drinker, right? That allows us to pay them more than a traditional importer would be able to. So we have this really, so we travel all over Europe, as Ken was mentioning earlier, because we are friends on Facebook, and I do often post my travels, and it's hard to feel sorry for a man who gets to do this all day long, right? We had arrived on a Sunday afternoon about 1 o'clock in Italy. The Italians' Sunday lunch goes on all day long. And we had arrived about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and we were there all day. You can't see it, but to the left of this photograph was a long table where about 30 of us spent the afternoon having lunch. And so with everything that they had produced or grown or raised on the farm. So this is a really important part of my work that I am very proud of. I want to talk a moment about the magic of wine and good, healthy wine and what wine does do. I talked about the dangers of alcohol, but there are some really compelling things that wine does. So wine lifts the spirit, right? And in small doses of alcohol, unlike higher doses, but in small doses of alcohol, we have, an enhanced euphoria, an expansion of creative expression. It's the reason we bond with people when we drink wine. I don't drink it in the daytime. I don't recommend that you do either. I only drink at dinner. I only eat 1 meal a day, with the exception if I'm in Italy and I'm forced into a lunch. You can't explain to an Italian that I'm ketogenic and I don't eat lunch. Right? They don't understand that. You also can't explain to them that I don't eat pasta, right? So when I'm there, I eat their pasta too. Or they think I was crazy and rude. So, yeah, it's pretty tasty, the Italian pasta. But the magic of wine is that it makes us, the one thing it really does that we talk the most about, it makes us just a little bit more emotionally available. And when we become a little bit more emotionally available, we become more loving. Now, anything you can do in your life to generate more love, I recommend you do more of it. And wine generates a lot of love. And so that's the magic of wine. And that happens for me and for us around a dinner table. I had a loving dinner last night, actually. I had dinner with Ken and Nancy, just the three of us, where we drank some wine, to be sure. And a lot of love at that table. And I appreciate that. Wine makes us vulnerable. Wine makes us a little bit more accessible. And when we're accessible, we can be seen, right? And being seen is a really important thing in life. So that's, I'll leave you with that. We have a few minutes for Q&A. I just talked about this idea. This is, again, some of our staff at a party last summer. As I mentioned, we have a lot of parties. And so it's a good life. So please enjoy some wine, and most importantly, express some more love in your life, and to those that you do, that you know and that you don't know. Questions? Anybody have any questions about, thank you. Here we are.
Do you grow any of your own fruit?
I do not. I'm not a farmer. I have, we buy wines from small family farms, and we have quite a few because of our size now. We have quite a few who make wines specifically to our criteria. But no, not a farmer. Yes?
How many calories in an ounce of your wine?
Well,
How many calories in an ounce of your wine?
in an ounce, I can tell you a glass which contains 5 ounces, so an ounce probably about, just under 100 calories. But I mean, when I think about nutrition, I don't think about calories. I think more about, because I'm ketogenic and because I believe that blood glucose is a more dangerous issue than calories. I don't really think about calories a lot, but I do think about sugar. But they are lower in, ours are lower in calories because they don't contain sugar. Yes. I think you need the mic.
How many winery do you represent? And mostly you said Italy, France, any other countries? Or?
All over Europe. So outside of
Austria.
Austria, in fact, we were pouring an Austrian red wine tonight. Austria, Hungary, Germany, just all across Europe are the primary producers. And we work with about 800 farms. Right. I'm not here to sell wine, but I'm glad that you asked, because somebody else asked me that tonight. We do. We have a special permit that allows us to ship wine to your door. But again, I'm not here to sell wine. I'm here to educate you. But yes, we can. Yes.
I have a question. At one wine tasting, I heard something about Mega Purple, but you don't
Mega
hear-
Purple.
What is Mega Purple exactly?
Mega Purple. Gosh, I'm glad you asked. I didn't even talk about Mega Purple. Over there, she's going to need the mic next. But Mega Purple is a color agent. It's manufactured by Gallo, who happens to be the largest wine producer in the world. I don't know if you've ever seen people get purple teeth and lips from drinking wine. That's generally attributed to, you won't get that from our wines, that's generally attributed to color agents. Americans believe that the darker a red wine is, the higher quality it is. There's no truth to that statement, but that is a commonly held myth. As a result, color agents are commonly used to make wine darker.
Yeah, I have a question. You said that the wine in EU had certain standards. Are those standards used when those European wines are exported to the US?
Yes.
They are, okay.
So it's also a myth that some, if I understand your question correctly, I want to make sure that I answer. The answer is yes, but it's also a commonly held myth among even some health leaders that the wine that's being exported from Europe to the US can be different than the wine that they are serving in Europe, and that's not true. It's the same wine. But that being said, just because it's a European wine doesn't mean that it's pure or healthy. There are 56 additives approved by the EU. So this additives problem and this industrial farming problem is a global problem. It's just that because of our standards, the wines that meet our rigid health and purity standards are grown primarily in Europe. But just on very small family farms, you can't make wine in very large quantities in these natural processes. Yes.
Okay. You say you have wine that's less than 75 parts per million in sulfites. What does regular wine, I was going to say regular wine, the industry wine have, and at what point do the sulfites actually become detrimental for your health?
Very few people have actual sulfite allergies. If less than 1%, if they do, I mean they're likely carrying an EpiPen around, right? So sulfites are contained in many foods. But to answer your first question, sulfites in the U.S. are allowed up to 350 parts per million in wine. We will not allow anything over 75, and how we come to 75 is that wines can be 75 parts per million naturally occurring. The average wines when we test U.S. wines are generally between 150 and 225 parts per million. So we rarely see, we don't test a lot of wines, we just do random testing on wines. We don't see 350 parts per million in U.S. wines, but we still see that they're quite high. But what sulfur does do, again, is it sterilizes the wine. So it, in fact, kills part of its soul in the way it tastes, and also some of its health benefits. In the back, right.
Do you have on your website a list of Italian vineyards? Do you have a list of Italian vineyards in your website?
We do not. We do not. So our farmers are not presently listed on our website. And the reason for that is because the logistical issue of managing it for us, because remember, these are small quantities, these are small production wines, so they're constantly rotating all the time, right? We sell over 1.5 million bottles a year, so it's like constantly rotating, but we cannot generally get more than, at the top side, 30 or 40,000 bottles, 50,000 bottles of any given one wine.
I was just curious, if you're driving around southern Italy, how would you differentiate a vineyard from one vineyard to the other that would be more natural? Because
That's a great question.
Yeah.
That's a great question. So natural farmers are, first of all, they're sort of bound together because they're a bit of an anomaly, and they're actually shunned by their neighbors, right? So because their neighbors don't understand why they do these crazy things, and so they know each other. In addition to that, there are natural wine fairs around the world. There are about 40 of them that are held primarily in Europe. There are 2 in the United States, where natural wine growers congregate at these fairs and show their wine. And in order to get in most of the fairs, they have to produce lab results and quantify their farming methods in order to qualify to be shown there. And then because we're the largest natural wine buyer in the world, they come to us. I mean, they identify us in some cases.
How would you value wine?
Well,
I mean, because apparently price is not, necessarily, it could be marketing. So, how would you say, yeah, this is a good bottle of wine?
Well, I value wine based on, well, first of all, assuming it meets all of our criteria, then we value it based on its taste, right? So there are a ton of studies out there, very famous and well-known studies that show that consumers believe the more they pay for a wine, the better it tastes, right? And so these blind studies where you take the same wine and tell a consumer it's $15 or $90, and consistently they'll tell you the $90 bottle tastes better, although it's the same as the $15 bottle, right? There's a ton of those studies. Yeah. It is marketing. So wine is sold through story. Remember, drinking from the chateau or farmhouse. Wine is sold through story and through scarcity. So they want you to believe that it's rare, right? Or that it's cult. And so once you create scarcity, you create value. Any other? Oh, here you go.
So when you're doing natural wines and with the natural yeast, how does that change the time for primary and secondary fermentation? Is it the same, or because you're not doing these additives, does that change the amount of time that it takes?
No, it doesn't. What it does, I often get this question, and this sort of relates to your question. No, it doesn't change the time, but when a wine is irrigated, it leads to much higher sugar levels at the time of harvest. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, it won't surprise you, when you fill a grape berry with water, it dilutes the flavor. So what the winemaker has to do in that case, when the flavor is diluted, you let the fruit get riper, right? So to develop better flavor, so it's higher in sugar. Well, the amount of sugar in a grape berry will ultimately determine the amount of alcohol in the wine, because if the wine, when it ferments, it has more sugar to eat, therefore it produces higher alcohol. Remember, we talked about lab-grown yeast withstanding higher alcohol environments, and then they use a technology to remove the alcohol, right, down to 15, 16%, maybe from 18 or 14 or whatever the goal of the winemaking style is. But because of irrigation, you end up with much higher sugar content in the fruit in order to have proper flavor, and that results in higher alcohol. It's also a winemaking style to pick fruit later, riper, sweeter. This is what people like, these bold, rich wines. But when you drink a natural wine, you feel much better. And so there's a distinct difference in how you feel. So I drank Napa Valley wines for years, which I assure you are not natural. I live in the heart of Napa Valley still, because it's I don't drink the wine, but it's a beautiful place to live. And the lifestyle is pretty incomparable for me. So I don't know how popular I am there anymore, but I haven't been tarred and feathered and run out of the valley yet. So, any other questions? Yeah, right here.
If the sulfur dioxide that's added to the wine kills the soul of the wine, why is it added?
Well, it's added as a preservative and as a sterilizer. So wines can develop bacterial faults, even post-bottling, if it's not super clean winemaking, right? It can pick up bacterial faults from the cellar in the bottling process. And so when you sterilize the wine, you kill any opportunity for these faults. In addition to that, it creates a shelf-worthy, kind of dependable, predictable product, what we call McDonaldizing the wine, right? That's why it's sterilized. And back in the back corner.
This will be the last question.
Thank you. Great talk. Loved it. We've tried to follow a lot of these same things. And one of the questions that we always had thought tequila was a more natural, less... Okay, is that any...
This is an awesome question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
This
I just
is an
wondered.
awesome question. Thank you. This is a great question to close on. I live in a world, in the paleo world, in the keto world, where tequila is the recommended drink of choice. And there's a simple reason for that. It's distilled. It's clean. I agree with all this. It comes from a plant. Seems like a great idea. I agree with all that. My problem with it is, and the reason I don't recommend it, is because it's 45% alcohol. And so if my goal is to drink less alcohol, drinking spirits is not a very effective way to do that. So that's my particular point of view. But it's a very popular recommendation inside the paleo and keto and the diet world to drink tequila. Vodka is also mentioned, but tequila is actually the sort of the spirit of choice. But remember, I talked about alcohol and it being a domino effect, right? And so when you have this surge of alcohol, then you're going to have a surge effect and then leading to more domino effect. And so I'm trying to drink less alcohol. I love wine. I've been drinking wine since I was 9. I love wine. I don't love alcohol as a drug. And so that's I'm glad you asked that, because I think that's an important distinction. If you're going to drink spirits, I think you should probably drink tequila.
On that note, let's thank our speaker.
Thank you.